"Don't get on that train," the girl said, not loud at first, but clear enough to slip through the hum of announcements and the echo of footsteps across polished concrete, and somehow that was what made Richard Caldwell stop, just for a second, his hand hovering inches from the cold steel door as the Amtrak line idled with a low mechanical breath, the scent of oil and metal hanging in the air. He didn't turn right away. Because men like him weren't used to being interrupted, especially not by a child, especially not here, where everything moved on schedule and every second was accounted for. But the silence that followed her voice wasn't normal. It wasn't the usual background noise of a busy station. It was thinner, sharper, like something had been cut out of the moment. When he finally looked back, he saw her standing near the edge of the platform, small, maybe 9 years old, her hoodie a little too big. Sleeves covering part of her hands, sneakers worn at the edges, but her eyes steady, locked on him like she wasn't afraid of anything he represented. Around him, his assistant leaned in, voice low, controlled. "Sir, boarding window closes in under a minute." While 2 security guards had already started moving toward the girl, their steps quick but practiced, like they'd done this before, like removing interruptions was part of the job. The girl didn't move, not when one of them reached for her arm, not when a few passengers nearby let out quiet chuckles, not when someone muttered something about kids making scenes. She just took a breath, a small one that lifted her shoulders barely an inch, and said it again, louder now. "Don't get on that train." And this time people turned, not all of them, but enough, a ripple through the crowd, heads shifting, conversations pausing mid-sentence. Richard felt it, that shift, the way attention tilted, and for a moment it irritated him, because he was used to controlling rooms, boardrooms, press conferences, entire companies, not being held in place by a child with no name he recognized. Still, something in her tone didn't match the chaos around her. It wasn't wild or panicked, it was precise, like she was pointing at something only she could see. "Sir?" The assistant pressed again, a little tighter now. "We really need to move." But Richard's eyes had narrowed slightly, just enough to take in more than he intended, the way the girl's gaze flicked past him, not at his face, but toward the train itself, toward the 3rd car down, her focus fixed like she'd memorized it. The guard's hand closed around her sleeve, firm but not rough, trying to guide her back. "All right, kid, let's step away." And that was when she twisted just enough to free her arm, not running, not fighting, just creating space to speak, her voice cutting through again, sharper this time. "There's something under it." And the words landed differently, because now there was detail, now there was direction, and even the people who had been smiling a second ago hesitated. Richard's jaw tightened, not in fear, not yet, but in calculation, because details mattered, they always had, they were the difference between risk and certainty. Between a deal that made billions and one that collapsed overnight. He glanced, almost without thinking, toward the line of cars, the brushed metal sides reflecting the overhead lights, the narrow gap beneath where shadows pooled, and something flickered in his memory, not clear, just a fragment. A man earlier, crouched too long near the tracks, a uniform that didn't quite match the others, a face that didn't meet his when their paths crossed. 30 seconds, the conductor called out, voice echoing down the platform. "Final boarding." And the doors gave a soft warning hiss, the kind that told everyone it was time to decide, to move or be left behind. Around Richard, people shifted, urgency returning, footsteps quickening, bags lifted, conversations snapping back into motion, because schedules didn't wait, and most people trusted the system more than a child's warning. His assistant exhaled, already half-turning. "We're good, sir, let's go." But Richard didn't move, not yet, his eyes still on the girl, who stood there breathing a little faster now, not crying, not pleading, just holding her ground like she was carrying something heavy that no one else could see. "What did you say?" he asked finally, his voice not loud, but it cut through everything around them, and the platform seemed to tighten again, attention pulling inward. The girl swallowed once, then answered, steady despite the way her hands trembled slightly at her sides. "The 3rd car. I saw someone put something under it." And for a moment, just a moment, Richard Caldwell, a man who had built his life on ignoring noise and focusing on signal, felt the line between the two blur in a way he couldn't immediately explain. The air did not move the way it should have, not with a full train ready to depart, not with hundreds of people shifting and talking and rushing forward, because something in the space between that girl's words and the polished steel of the third car had tightened, like a wire pulled too far. Richard Caldwell did not look at his assistant this time, did not acknowledge the growing impatience in the voices around him. Because his attention had narrowed into something sharper, something quieter. The way it always did when a decision mattered more than reputation. "Who did you see?" he asked, his tone even, controlled, but the question landed heavier than expected, and the girl hesitated just long enough for doubt to ripple through the nearby crowd before she answered. "A man in a gray jacket." He kept looking around, like he did not want anyone to notice, and then he bent down near the wheels, like he dropped something, but he did not pick it back up. And her words were not dramatic. Not exaggerated, just simple, direct, like she was describing something obvious. One of the guards exhaled softly, already dismissing it. "Sir, maintenance crews are everywhere down here, that is normal." But Richard's eyes flicked once more toward the train, tracing the length of the cars, counting without meaning to 1, 2, 3, the third car sitting exactly where she had said, the reflection of the overhead lights bending along its side, the shadow beneath it deeper than the others. "Because of the angle. We are out of time." The conductor called again, louder now, the doors releasing a sharper hiss, and passengers began stepping inside, their movements quicker, more decisive. Because hesitation in a place like this meant missing what came next, Richard's assistant shifted closer, lowering his voice. "If we delay this, it affects the entire schedule, media will notice, the board will notice." But the words did not land the way they normally would, because another thought had surfaced, quieter but heavier, the kind that did not go away once it appeared. He had built everything by noticing what others ignored, by trusting instincts others called unnecessary, and right. Now, the girl was not pleading, she was not guessing, she was holding on to something with a certainty that did not match her age. He looked back at her, really looked this time, past the worn fabric of her hoodie, past the way her fingers curled slightly as if bracing against something unseen, into the steadiness in her gaze, and there was no performance there, no attempt to convince. Just a kind of quiet urgency that did not need approval. "What is your name?" he asked, and the question seemed to surprise her more than anything else, like she had not expected to be seen beyond the interruption. "Amara," she said, her voice softer now but still steady. "Amara Johnson." And for a moment, that name seemed to settle into the space between them, grounding something that had been abstract seconds before. A man nearby let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "You are really going to listen to a kid?" And a few others echoed the sentiment with low murmurs, the kind that built quickly when people needed reassurance that everything was still normal. Richard did not respond to them, because normal was not what he was feeling, not anymore. He took a single step back from the train door, and it was small, almost unnoticeable, but it shifted everything, because his body had made a decision before his words had. The assistant blinked, caught off guard. "Sir?" But Richard raised a hand slightly, not to silence him completely, just enough to pause the pressure. His gaze moved once more to the third car, and this time he let the memory surface fully, the man in gray, the way he had lingered just a second too long, the way he had avoided eye contact, details that had meant nothing at the time now aligning in a way that was harder to ignore. The platform noise surged again as more passengers boarded, the last calls echoing overhead, and the conductor stepped closer to the door, preparing to seal it. Richard's voice came low, measured, but it carried. "Hold the train." And for a split second, no one moved, because the command did not belong to the usual order of things, not here, not like this. The conductor hesitated, eyes narrowing slightly. "Sir, we cannot delay without cause." And that was the moment, the line between doubt and action, between walking away and stepping into something uncertain. Richard exhaled slowly, then turned fully toward the staff, his posture shifting into something unmistakable, the kind that had moved markets and redirected entire companies. "You have your cause," he said, nodding once toward Amara. "Now check under the third car." And the silence that followed was no longer confusion, it was tension, thick and immediate, because for the first time, people were not looking at him for direction, they were looking at the space beneath that train, and wondering what they might have missed. No one moved at first, not because they did not hear him, but because what he asked for did not fit the rhythm of the place, and for a moment the entire platform seemed to hesitate between routine and uncertainty. The conductor glanced toward the staff at the far end, then back at Richard, as if weighing whether authority could override procedure, while a few passengers near the doors shifted uncomfortably, their boarding passes still in hand, unsure whether to step forward or step back. One of the maintenance workers, a man in a reflective vest standing several yards away, frowned and walked closer, his boots echoing softly against the concrete. "What exactly are we looking for?" he asked, not dismissive, but cautious, the kind of tone used when something might be real but should not be. Richard did not answer immediately, because his eyes had already returned to Amara, and she had not moved, not since she said it, her gaze still fixed on that same point beneath the third car, as if the rest of the world had faded around her. "Something that does not belong," Richard said finally, his voice calm, but firm enough to carry, and the phrasing shifted something subtle in the air, because now it was not about a child's claim, it was about an anomaly, a deviation, something every system was trained to recognize. The maintenance worker nodded once, then motioned to another crew member, and together they moved toward the train, their steps slower now, deliberate, as if the ground itself had changed. The crowd's energy shifted with them, conversations lowering, eyes following, a quiet tension spreading outward like ripples in still water. Amara's fingers tightened slightly at her sides, not in fear, but in anticipation, and for the first time her breathing seemed uneven, like she had been holding it steady for too long. Richard noticed it, the small rise and fall of her shoulders, the way her focus never broke. And something in him registered that whatever she had seen, she was reliving it now, frame by frame. "Where exactly?" one of the crew called out as they reached the third car, crouching slightly to peer beneath the metal frame. But the angle was wrong, the shadows too deep. Amara stepped forward a fraction, her voice quieter now but just as clear. "Closer to the middle, not near the wheels, a little behind them." And the specificity made the man pause before adjusting his position, lowering himself further, one knee touching the ground as he leaned in. The station seemed to hold its breath. Even the overhead announcements fading into the background as if someone had turned the volume down on everything else. Richard could hear the faint hum of the train's systems, the distant echo of footsteps from another platform, but all of it felt distant compared to the single point of focus now under that car. His assistant stood a step behind him, no longer speaking, the earlier urgency replaced by something quieter, more watchful, because even he could feel that the situation had moved beyond inconvenience. A few passengers began stepping back from the train doors, not in panic, but in subtle shifts, creating space without fully understanding why. The crew member under the car adjusted again, reaching further into the shadow, his movements slower now, more careful, and then he stopped. It was not dramatic, not sudden, just a pause, but it carried weight, because his body had gone still in a way that suggested he had found something that did not match expectation. "Hey!" he called softly, not loudly, not alarmed, but different enough to draw immediate attention, and his partner moved closer, crouching beside him, both of them now focused on the same point. Richard felt something settle in his chest, not relief, not fear, but confirmation, the quiet recognition that the line between instinct and reality had just shifted. He did not move closer, did not speak, because this moment did not belong to him, it belonged to what was being uncovered, to the truth emerging from beneath something everyone else had walked past. Amara stood still, her eyes never leaving the scene, but her posture changed. Just slightly, the tension in her shoulders easing a fraction, as if the weight she had been carrying was finally being shared. The second crew member leaned in further, then slowly reached out, not grabbing, not pulling, just touching whatever was there as if confirming its presence. And then he looked up, meeting his partner's eyes in a silent exchange that said more than words could. The conductor took a step back from the door, his earlier confidence replaced by caution, and one by one, The passengers closest to the train followed suit, their movements quiet but coordinated, as if guided by an understanding that had not been spoken aloud. Richard finally exhaled, a slow, controlled breath, his gaze shifting from the crew back to Amara, and for the first time since she spoke, there was no question in his expression, only recognition, because whatever had been dismissed seconds ago was now unfolding in front of everyone, and it had started with a voice most people would have ignored. Amara blinked once, her focus softening just enough to meet his eyes. And in that brief connection, something passed between them, not gratitude, not yet, but acknowledgement, the kind that did not need words, because the truth she had pointed to was no longer invisible, and the station, once loud and certain, now stood in a quiet, shifting awareness of how close it had come to missing something that had been there all along. The crew member did not pull the object out right away, and that hesitation spoke louder than any announcement ever could, because trained hands do not slow down unless something feels wrong. He shifted his weight carefully, leaning back just enough to look at his partner, and the look they exchanged was quiet but unmistakable, a silent agreement that what they were seeing was not routine, not something they could brush off as debris or a loose part. "We need a supervisor down here," he said, his voice steady but lower than before, as if the air itself required a different tone now, and that single sentence moved through the platform faster than any alarm, changing posture, changing breathing, changing the way people held their bags and glanced at each other without fully understanding why. The conductor stepped further away from the door, one hand instinctively reaching for his radio, speaking into it in clipped, controlled phrases, while the assistant behind Richard straightened, no longer trying to rush him forward, because the moment had shifted beyond schedules and optics into something that demanded attention. Amara remained still, but her eyes flickered once toward the crew and then back to the ground beneath the train, as if confirming that what she had seen was exactly where it should be, and yet there was something else now, a faint crease in her brow, not fear, but concentration. Like she was remembering more than she had said. Richard noticed it immediately. The way her focus tightened again, and he stepped slightly closer, not enough to crowd her, just enough to lower the distance between question and answer. "What else did you see?" he asked quietly, and his voice carried a different weight now, not authority over her, but alignment with her. Amara hesitated for the first time, her fingers curling inward as she searched for the words, and when she spoke, it was slower, more deliberate. "He did not just leave it, he looked back at it twice, like he was checking something, and then he walked away. Fast, not like someone who works here, more like someone who did not want to be late." And the detail landed with precision, painting a clearer picture than before, because it was not just about the object, it was about behavior, intention, something that did not belong in a place built on routine. The supervisor arrived moments later, breath slightly elevated from the quick approach, crouching beside the two crew members, his expression shifting as they spoke in low tones, pointing carefully beneath the car, and he nodded once slowly, the kind of nod that acknowledges a situation has moved beyond ordinary procedure. "Clear the immediate area," he instructed, not loudly, but firmly enough that nearby staff began guiding passengers a few steps back, not with panic, but with calm, practiced gestures, widening the space around the train without triggering alarm. The crowd responded in subtle waves, people stepping aside, creating distance, conversations dropping to whispers, eyes fixed on the small cluster of workers beneath the third car. Richard stood at the edge of that shifting boundary, his posture still, his gaze steady, but inside, the calculation had changed, because the cost of ignoring a detail had just revealed itself, and it was larger than any delay, any headline, any inconvenience he had been warned about. His assistant leaned in slightly, voice quieter than it had been all day. "You were right to stop it." But Richard did not answer because the word right did not feel accurate, not yet, not until the full truth surfaced. Instead, he looked at Amara again, and this time there was no distance in his expression, only a quiet acknowledgement that she had seen something the entire system had missed. Amara shifted her weight, the tension in her shoulders easing just a fraction, but her eyes remained alert, scanning the scene with a focus that did not match her age, and for a moment, she looked less like a child and more like someone who had learned, somehow, to pay attention in ways others did not. Beneath the train, the supervisor reached in carefully, not pulling anything free, just examining, confirming, and then he withdrew slightly, turning to speak into his radio, his tone measured but unmistakably serious. The platform seemed to respond to that tone alone, the space growing quieter, heavier, as if everyone present could feel that something significant was unfolding even without understanding the details. A distant announcement began to play over the speakers, routine information about another track, but it felt out of place now, almost distant. Like it belonged to a different moment. Richard exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, and, for the first time since he had stepped onto the platform, he felt the absence of control, not in a way that threatened him, but in a way that reminded him that control had limits, that systems had blind spots, and that sometimes those blind spots were only visible to someone standing outside of them. Amara finally looked away from the train and up at him again, her expression softer now, but still steady. And in that brief exchange, there was a shift, subtle but undeniable, because the power dynamic that had existed minutes ago had quietly reversed, not through force, not through argument, but through truth. And as the supervisor finished speaking into his radio and turned back toward the crew with a nod that signaled the next step, the platform held its breath once more, suspended in that fragile space between discovery and understanding, where everything that came next would change how this moment was remembered. The supervisor's nod was small, almost invisible, but it triggered movement with precision, because systems like this did not rely on noise, they relied on signals, and now every trained instinct on that platform had aligned in the same direction. 2 additional personnel arrived within seconds, their presence calm but purposeful, carrying equipment that was not part of routine maintenance. And that alone shifted the atmosphere again, turning curiosity into quiet certainty that something real was being handled. "We are going to take a closer look," the supervisor said to no one in particular, yet everyone seemed to hear it, and the space widened another few feet as passengers instinctively stepped back, creating a perimeter without being told twice. Richard remained still at the edge of it, his gaze following every movement, not out of control anymore, but out of respect for the process unfolding in front of him. Beside him, Amara exhaled slowly, the first full breath she had taken since the moment she spoke, and her shoulders dropped just slightly, as if the weight she had been carrying was finally being shared by people who understood what to do with it. One of the specialists crouched low beneath the third car, adjusting his angle with careful, measured movements, and for a moment there was only the sound of fabric brushing against concrete and the faint hum of the train's idle systems. Then he reached in, not abruptly, but with a deliberate gentleness, as if confirming something before committing to action, and when his hand made contact, he paused again, signaling silently to the others before slowly drawing back. What he revealed was not dramatic in appearance, not something that would stand out to an untrained eye, but the way everyone around him reacted made its significance clear, because they did not dismiss it, they did not question it, they simply adjusted, stepping into a different level of focus. The supervisor leaned closer, examining it without touching, then nodded once more, this time with finality, and spoke into his radio with a tone that carried weight beyond the immediate moment. Richard felt it settle into the space like a quiet confirmation, the kind that did not need explanation to be understood. And for the first time since this began, the platform did not feel uncertain, it felt redirected. The conductor moved further back, guiding the last few passengers away from the train doors, his earlier urgency replaced by calm instruction, while the assistant at Richard's side remained silent, his posture straighter, his usual confidence replaced by observation. Amara watched everything, her eyes following the object now being carefully handled, and there was no surprise in her expression. Only a quiet acknowledgement that what she had seen was now visible to everyone else. Richard turned slightly toward her, lowering himself just enough to meet her at eye level, and when he spoke, his voice was different from before, softer, more deliberate. "You knew something was wrong?" And Amara shook her head once, gently. "I did not know. I just noticed." And that distinction lingered in the air, simple but powerful, because it shifted the moment from something extraordinary to something human, something anyone could have done, but no one else had. The specialists continued their work with precision, carefully securing the object and communicating in low, steady voices. And as they did, the platform seemed to breathe again, not fully, but enough to release the tightness that had held it in place. A distant announcement resumed, blending back into the environment, but it sounded different now, less dominant, more like background noise than command. Richard stood slowly, his posture returning, but not in the same way as before, because something had shifted inside that did not reverse as easily as a step. He looked once more at the train, at the third car that had nearly carried him forward without question, and then back at Amara, who now stood with her hands relaxed at her sides, the tension gone but the awareness still present. People nearby began to murmur again, their voices low but filled with a different kind of energy, not confusion, but realization, the kind that comes when a moment changes direction in a way that cannot be undone. The supervisor approached briefly, offering a nod toward Richard, not elaborate, just enough to acknowledge the decision that had been made, and then he turned back to his team. Because the work was not finished yet, Richard did not respond with words because none felt necessary, and instead he shifted his attention fully to Amara once more, as if recognizing that the most important part of this moment had not been the object beneath the train, but the voice that had pointed to it. Amara met his gaze without hesitation, and in that quiet exchange, something settled, not as a conclusion, but as the beginning of understanding. Because what had just happened was not only about what had been found, it was about what had almost been missed, and the realization that sometimes, the smallest interruption carries the weight of everything that follows. The platform did not return to normal, not fully, because once something invisible becomes visible, it changes how everything is seen afterward, and now every sound, every movement, every passing glance felt sharper, more deliberate, like the world had slowed just enough for people to notice what they usually ignored. The specialists continued working beneath the third car, their motions controlled and methodical, speaking in low tones that carried meaning without needing volume, while the supervisor stood just behind them, arms loosely crossed, watching not with urgency, but with focus, the kind that came from experience. Richard remained where he was, but the distance between him and the center of attention had shifted, because he was no longer the axis of the moment, he was part of it, and that realization settled quietly in the way he held himself. Beside him, Amara shifted her weight slightly, her gaze no longer fixed on a single point but moving now, taking in the broader scene, the people, the workers, the way the crowd had rearranged itself into a quiet circle of awareness. "Do you travel often?" Richard asked after a moment, his voice softer than before, not because he needed to lower it, but because the question itself required a different tone. Amara glanced up at him, a brief flicker of curiosity crossing her face. "Not really," she said. "Just sometimes, when my grandma needs to go somewhere." And as if on cue, an older woman standing a few steps back lifted her chin slightly, her posture protective but calm, watching the exchange without interruption. Richard nodded once, absorbing the answer, then looked back toward the train, where the object had now been carefully secured within a containment case, its presence no longer exposed but not dismissed either, and the way the team handled it made one thing clear: this was not a misunderstanding. It was a deviation that had been found before it could become something larger. The conductor walked past them slowly, his earlier confidence replaced by quiet professionalism, speaking into his radio about delays and rerouting, his tone measured, controlled, as if ensuring that the system continued to function even as it adjusted. A few passengers nearby began to check their phones, murmuring softly, their voices no longer impatient but reflective, the kind that comes after something unexpected forces a pause. Amara watched them for a second, then looked back at Richard, her expression thoughtful now. "They did not see it," she said, not as a question, but as an observation, and Richard followed her gaze, taking in the faces around them, the suits, the luggage, the hurried steps that had almost carried everyone forward without a second thought. "No," he replied after a moment, his voice steady. "They did not." And there was no judgment in it, only acknowledgement. Amara nodded slightly, as if that confirmed something she already understood, then looked down at her hands, brushing her sleeve with her fingers in a small, absent motion. "I almost did not say anything," she added quietly, and the words lingered between them longer than expected, because they revealed something deeper than the moment itself. They revealed the hesitation, the internal debate that had happened before her voice broke through the noise. Richard's gaze sharpened just slightly, not in intensity, but in recognition. "What made you say it?" he asked, and this time the question carried more weight, because it was not about the event anymore, it was about the decision behind it. Amara took a small breath, her eyes lifting again. "It felt wrong to stay quiet," she said simply. And the simplicity of it cut through everything else, because there was no strategy in that answer, no calculation, just a clear line between what felt right and what did not. Richard held her gaze for a moment longer, then looked away, not to dismiss her, but to absorb what she had said, because it echoed something he had known once, something that had become quieter over time beneath layers of meetings and numbers and expectations. The supervisor approached again, stopping a few feet away. His expression composed but different now, more open. "We are going to keep the train here for further inspection," he said, addressing Richard directly. "We appreciate the call you made." And Richard inclined his head slightly, but his attention shifted back to Amara almost immediately, because the credit did not belong where it was being placed. "It was her," he said, nodding toward her, and the supervisor's gaze followed, resting on Amara with a brief, assessing look that softened almost instantly into something like respect. "Then we appreciate you speaking up," he said to her, his tone direct but warm, and Amara nodded once, not smiling, not seeking acknowledgement, just accepting the moment as it was. The platform settled into a quieter rhythm, not the rushed urgency from before, but a slower, more aware movement, as if everyone present had been reminded that certainty was not always what it seemed. Richard glanced once more at the train, then back at Amara, and something in his posture shifted again, not visibly to others, but enough that he felt it, a subtle realignment. Because this moment had not just delayed a journey, it had interrupted something deeper, something he had not realized needed interruption. Amara looked up at the station clock for a second, then back at the train, her expression thoughtful again, as if replaying the moment in her mind, not with fear, but with clarity, and as the distant hum of another arriving train echoed faintly through the structure, the space they stood in felt suspended between what had happened and what would come next, held together by a decision that had almost never been made. The station clock ticked forward by another minute, but time no longer felt linear, it stretched and folded around the moment, because what had happened refused to settle into something ordinary. The train remained still, its doors now closed not for departure but for inspection, the polished metal reflecting a platform that had changed in ways most people could not quite explain. Richard stood with his hands loosely at his sides, his posture composed but quieter than before, as if the usual momentum that carried him from one decision to the next had slowed just enough to let something else surface. Amara shifted her gaze again, this time toward the far end of the platform where two officers had arrived, their presence calm, their movements deliberate as they spoke with the supervisor and the specialists, and although their voices did not carry, the tone did, measured, confirming that what had been found was not being dismissed. A faint breeze moved through the station, carrying the distant scent of diesel and something metallic, and Amara inhaled softly, her shoulders rising just a fraction before settling again, like she was grounding herself in the present. "Are you okay?" Richard asked, the question simple but different from anything he had said before, and Amara looked at him for a moment, considering it, then nodded once. "I think so," she replied, and the honesty in that answer felt more real than certainty. A few steps behind her, her grandmother adjusted her grip on a small handbag, her eyes moving between Amara and the officials, protective but composed, as if she trusted her granddaughter but did not yet trust the world around her. Richard noticed that too, the quiet vigilance, and it reminded him of something distant, something from a time when trust was not assumed but earned. "You did something important," he said after a moment, not as praise, not exaggerated, just a statement, and Amara looked down briefly, her fingers brushing the edge of her sleeve again. "I just said what I saw," she replied, and the words carried the same clarity as before, unembellished, grounded. Nearby, a group of passengers spoke in low tones, their earlier impatience replaced with a kind of subdued awareness. One man shaking his head slightly as he replayed the moment to someone on the phone, while another woman stood quietly, watching the officials with a thoughtful expression, as if reconsidering how quickly she had been ready to board. The platform had not returned to noise, it had settled into something more reflective, a space where people were present in a different way. The supervisor walked back toward them, his steps steady, stopping just within speaking distance. "We are coordinating with additional teams," he said, his voice calm. "It may take some time before we can clear or move this train." And Richard nodded, not with impatience, but with understanding, because time no longer held the same priority it had minutes ago. "Do what you need to do," he replied, and the supervisor acknowledged it with a brief nod before turning back, his focus already shifting to the next task. Amara watched him go, then glanced up at Richard again, her eyes curious now. "Were you in a hurry?" she asked, and the question landed gently, but it carried more weight than expected. Richard paused, the answer forming and then reshaping itself, because the version he would have given earlier no longer fit as easily. "I thought I was," he said finally, and there was something in the way he said it that made the words feel different, like they were being understood for the first time. Amara nodded slightly, as if that made sense, then looked back toward the train, her gaze softer now, less searching, more reflective. A distant train horn echoed faintly through the station, long and low, and for a moment it felt like a reminder that movement continued elsewhere, even as this place remained paused. Richard followed the sound briefly, then brought his attention back, because what was here mattered more now than what was waiting somewhere else. His assistant shifted behind him, stepping closer but no longer pressing, his voice careful. "We can arrange alternative transportation," he offered, and Richard considered it, the efficiency of the suggestion, the ease of moving forward as if this moment were simply an obstacle to navigate. But he did not answer right away, because something in him resisted that instinct now, the need to move past rather than stay present. Amara's grandmother stepped forward slightly, placing a gentle hand on Amara's shoulder, not pulling her away, just anchoring her, and Amara leaned into it just a fraction, acknowledging the touch without breaking her focus. Richard watched that interaction quietly, the simplicity of it, the connection. And it contrasted sharply with the structured world he was used to, where interactions were often measured, strategic. "We will stay," he said after a moment, not to anyone in particular, but the words settled around them, signaling a choice that extended beyond logistics. The assistant nodded once, accepting it without question, and stepped back again, adapting as he always did. The officials near the train began to reposition, their movements indicating the next phase of their work, and although the details remained unclear to most, the direction was evident. This was not over yet. Amara looked up at Richard one more time, her expression calm, but there was something new in it now, not urgency, not tension, but a quiet understanding that what had happened between them had changed something, even if either of them could fully name it yet. And as the platform remained suspended in that delicate balance between pause and progression, the moment continued to unfold, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a steady, undeniable shift that would carry forward long after the train itself moved again. The longer the platform stayed quiet, the more noticeable the small details became, the ticking of the overhead clock, the faint vibration beneath the soles of shoes as another train passed somewhere deeper in the station, the soft rustle of coats and bags as people adjusted their stance without thinking. It was no longer a place of movement, it had become a place of observation. And that shift held everyone in a kind of suspended awareness. The officials near the third car continued their work with steady precision, one of them carefully documenting the object now secured, another speaking into a radio with clipped, measured updates that carried authority without urgency. Richard watched them, but his focus drifted back to Amara more often now, as if the center of gravity for this entire moment had quietly shifted toward her. She stood beside her grandmother, one hand lightly resting against the older woman's coat, her posture relaxed but alert, her eyes moving not with fear but with attention, taking in everything as if it mattered equally. "What made you notice him?" Richard asked after a moment, his voice low enough that it did not travel beyond them, and Amara looked at him thoughtfully, not rushing the answer. He did not walk like everyone else, she said. Everyone was moving towards something, but he was moving away from it, like he already knew where he was going. And the explanation was simple, but it carried a depth that settled into Richard's mind, because it was not about the object anymore, it was about awareness, about seeing patterns and recognizing when something broke them. Richard nodded slowly, absorbing that, because it echoed something he had relied on for years but had not articulated in such a clear way. Nearby, a woman who had been standing close earlier stepped a little further back, her expression thoughtful as she looked toward the train, then down at her phone, as if recalibrating her sense of what mattered in that moment. The assistant shifted again, stepping closer but still careful not to interrupt, his voice quieter now, almost reflective. Security is coordinating with local authorities. They are reviewing cameras. And Richard acknowledged it with a slight tilt of his head, but his attention did not fully return to logistics. It remained anchored in the present, and the immediate reality unfolding in front of him. Amara's grandmother spoke softly for the first time, her voice gentle but steady. You did right, baby. And the words carried a warmth that contrasted with the tension that had filled the space earlier, and Amara leaned slightly into her side, not needing more than that to understand she was not alone in what she had done. Richard noticed that too, the quiet reinforcement, the kind that did not demand recognition but provided it anyway, and it lingered with him in a way he did not expect. The supervisor approached once more, stopping just within their circle, his expression composed but more open now. We are confirming details, he said. There will be an official report, but for now, we are holding all departures on this line. And the statement carried weight, because it extended the impact of this moment beyond a single train, beyond a single decision. Richard nodded again, but this time his gaze moved briefly across the platform, taking in the wider effect, the way other passengers were now standing in small clusters, speaking quietly, the way movement had slowed across the entire space. Amara followed his gaze, then looked back at him, her expression curious again. Does this happen a lot? She asked, and the question held no fear, just a desire to understand. Richard considered it, the truth forming carefully. Not often, he said, but when it does, it matters that someone notices. And the words felt different as he spoke them, like they were being shaped by the moment rather than pulled from habit. Amara nodded once, accepting that, then looked back toward the train, her eyes softer now, less searching, more reflective. The officials continued to move with quiet efficiency, and the object was transferred carefully to another secured container, each step deliberate, each motion confirming that what had been found was being handled with the seriousness it required. The platform responded to that process not with panic, but with a growing sense of clarity, the kind that comes when uncertainty begins to resolve into understanding. Richard exhaled slowly, feeling the shift settle deeper. Because this moment had not just interrupted his schedule, it had interrupted something internal, something that had been moving too quickly to notice the smaller details that now seemed essential. Amara adjusted her stance again, her hands slipping from her grandmother's coat as she stood more independently now, her posture steady, her presence no longer blending into the background but holding its own space. Richard looked at her, really looked. And there was no trace of dismissal left in his expression, only recognition, the kind that comes when something changes how you see not just a moment, but the pattern behind it. And as the distant sound of another announcement echoed faintly through the station, blending back into the environment, the platform remained in that quiet state of awareness, where every person present understood, even without words, that what had just happened would not simply pass, it would stay, shaping how they moved forward, how they noticed, and how they listened the next time something small tried to be heard. The station did not feel like a station anymore, not in the way it had just minutes ago, because something subtle but permanent had shifted in how people occupied the space, the hurried rhythm replaced by something slower, more aware, as if every person present had been quietly reminded that certainty could be interrupted without warning. The officials continued their work with calm precision, one of them stepping aside to speak into a phone now, his tone measured but more formal. signaling that the situation had moved beyond the immediate platform and into a wider chain of response. Richard stood with his gaze fixed not on the object anymore, but on the process, the way each step followed the last with intention. And for the first time in a long while, he was not thinking about outcomes, he was watching how decisions were made in real time. Beside him, Amara shifted slightly, her attention drawn toward a new movement at the far end of the platform where a small group of additional personnel had arrived, their presence quiet but distinct, carrying the kind of focus that did not need explanation. "They are taking it seriously," she said, her voice soft but certain, and Richard nodded once, because that was exactly what he was seeing, a system responding not out of panic, but out of recognition. "They are," he replied, and there was something in his tone that carried more than agreement, it carried a kind of respect that had not been there before. Amara glanced up at him, studying his expression for a brief second, as if noticing the change, then looked back toward the train, her posture relaxed but attentive, like someone who had learned to stay aware even after the moment of urgency had passed. A man nearby lowered his phone after finishing a quiet conversation, his face thoughtful, as if the story he had just told someone else still needed time to settle in his own mind, and that feeling seemed to ripple outward, small conversations forming and dissolving, each one carrying a version of what had just happened. Richard's assistant stepped closer again, his voice careful, almost reflective now. "Media will pick this up, sir. It will be everywhere within the hour." And the statement was not a warning this time, it was an observation, one that belonged to the world Richard usually operated in, where moments became narratives quickly. Richard did not respond right away, because the idea of how this would look felt distant compared to what it had meant, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than expected. "That is not what matters." And the words settled with a weight that surprised even him, because they were not strategic, they were simply true. Amara heard it, her eyes flicking toward him again, and for a brief second, there was a hint of something like understanding in her expression, as if she recognized that shift without needing it explained. Her grandmother adjusted her stance beside her, one hand resting gently on Amara's shoulder again, grounding her in the present, and Amara leaned into it just slightly, her attention still split between the comfort of that touch and the unfolding scene. The supervisor returned once more, this time with a different posture, less focused on immediate action and more on communication. "We are going to relocate passengers shortly," he said, addressing those nearby. "There will be delays, but we will provide updates." And his voice carried calm assurance, the kind that helped restore order without erasing what had happened. Richard nodded in acknowledgement, but his focus returned to Amara almost immediately, because the center of this moment had never truly left her. "You changed something today," he said quietly, not as a compliment, not as a statement meant to impress, but as a simple recognition of impact, and Amara looked down for a second, her fingers brushing lightly against her sleeve again. "I just did not want something bad to happen," she replied, and the honesty of it cut through everything else, because it stripped the moment down to its core, not recognition, not consequence, just intention. Richard absorbed that, the simplicity of it, the clarity, and it settled deeper than any complex explanation could have, because it reminded him of something he had not felt in a long time, the idea that action did not always need to be calculated. That sometimes it could be immediate, grounded in something as simple as what felt right. The officials near the train began to reposition again, their movements indicating that the immediate phase of their work was nearing completion, and the object that had drawn all this attention was now fully contained, no longer visible, but its presence still felt in the way everyone carried themselves. Amara watched that final step with quiet focus, then let out a small breath, almost like a release, and when she looked back up, her expression had softened even more, the tension fully gone now, replaced by a calm awareness. Richard noticed it, the shift from urgency to stillness. And it mirrored something within him, a sense that the moment had moved from action into understanding, from interruption into meaning. The platform slowly began to adjust again, people gathering their belongings, repositioning themselves as instructions filtered through, but the movement was different now, more deliberate, less automatic. And as the distant sound of another train echoed faintly through the station, Blending with the low murmur of voices and the steady rhythm of footsteps returning, the space held on to what had just happened, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a quiet, lasting way, like a memory forming in real time, one that would shape how this place, and the people within it, would see the next moment when something small tried to be heard. The station began to breathe again, but it was not the same breath as before. It was slower, deeper, like something had shifted beneath the surface that could not be undone. Announcements resumed with careful clarity, voices over the speakers guiding passengers toward alternate platforms, and people responded, gathering their bags, adjusting their paths, but there was a hesitation now in the way they moved. A quiet awareness that lingered in their steps. Richard stood where he was for a moment longer, watching the controlled unraveling of what had once been a simple departure, and for the first time in years, he did not feel the urge to rush ahead of it. Instead, he turned toward Amara fully, not as someone acknowledging a moment, but as someone recognizing a person. "Where are you headed?" he asked, and the question felt different from the ones before, more grounded, more present. Amara glanced at her grandmother, then back at him. "Philadelphia," she said, her voice steady. "We were supposed to be on that train." And the weight of that statement settled quietly between them, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just real. Richard nodded slowly, his eyes shifting briefly to the train behind them, the one that now sat still under layers of attention and protocol, and then back to her. "Then I am glad you were not," he said, and the words carried a sincerity that did not need emphasis. Amara held his gaze for a second, then gave a small nod, accepting the truth of it without needing to respond further. Her grandmother stepped slightly forward, her voice calm but firm. "Thank you for listening to her," she said, and Richard turned to her, meeting her eyes with the same steadiness he had shown Amara. "She made it impossible not to," he replied, and there was no hint of deflection in his tone, only acknowledgement. The older woman studied him for a brief moment, then nodded once, as if deciding that was enough. Nearby, the assistant shifted again, stepping closer but no longer interrupting, his role now more supportive than directive. "We can arrange a private car, sir," he offered quietly. "Or a flight within the hour." And the suggestion hung there, efficient, familiar, the kind of solution that would have ended this moment quickly in any other circumstance. Richard considered it, the ease of stepping back into the world he controlled, where movement was immediate and friction minimal. But something in him resisted that simplicity now. He looked back at Amara, at the way she stood beside her grandmother, grounded, present, not seeking anything from what had just happened, and he felt the contrast between that and the world he was used to navigating. "No," he said finally, his voice calm but certain. "We will wait." And the decision landed quietly, but it carried weight, because it was not about logistics. It was about staying within the moment rather than moving past it. The assistant nodded once, accepting the shift without question, adapting as he always had, but this time with a different understanding of why. Amara glanced up at Richard again, her expression curious. "You do not have to," she said, and the simplicity of it made him pause for a second before answering. "I know," he replied, and there was something in his tone that suggested he had only just realized that himself. The platform continued to adjust around them, passengers being guided toward new routes, staff coordinating with quiet efficiency, and the train that had been at the center of everything now stood as a reminder rather than a destination. The supervisor approached once more, his expression composed but now carrying a hint of resolution. "We will have updates soon," he said, addressing them briefly before moving on, his attention already shifting to the next task. Richard watched him go, then turned back to Amara, his posture lowering slightly as he brought himself closer to her level again, not out of necessity, but out of respect. "You trusted what you saw," he said, and this time it sounded less like a statement and more like a realization. Amara thought about it for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I just did not want to ignore it," she replied, and the words settled deeper than anything else she had said so far, because they carried a choice within them, a moment where she could have stayed quiet but did not. Richard absorbed that, the weight of it, because it reflected something he had not done, not today, but in ways he could not fully name yet. the station lights cast a soft glow across the platform, reflecting off polished surfaces and creating a quiet brightness that contrasted with the tension that had filled the space earlier. People continued to move, but the energy was different now, more intentional, more aware. Amara's grandmother adjusted her coat slightly, her hand resting again on Amara's shoulder, a small, steady gesture that anchored them both. Richard noticed it, the simplicity of that connection, and it lingered with him as something real, something not built or managed, just present. Things change quickly, Amara said suddenly, her voice thoughtful, and Richard looked at her, considering the statement. They do, he replied, but this time the words felt less like an observation and more like an understanding, because this moment had changed something in him in a way he had not anticipated. Amara nodded once, then looked back toward the train, her expression calm, as if she had already moved through the urgency and arrived at something quieter, and as the station continued its slow return to motion, the moment they stood and did not fade, it settled, becoming something that would not be left behind when they finally moved again, but carried forward, shaping what came next in ways that had not yet fully revealed themselves. The platform had begun to reorganize itself into a new rhythm, not the hurried urgency from before, but something steadier, more intentional, as if every movement now carried awareness of what had almost happened. Announcements echoed overhead with calm precision, directing passengers toward alternate routes, and people followed, not rushing, but adjusting, their voices lower, their steps more measured. Richard remained where he was. Even as others moved past him, his attention no longer pulled by schedules or obligations, but anchored in the moment that had just unfolded. Amara stood beside her grandmother, her posture relaxed, but her eyes still alert, taking in the shifting scene with a quiet understanding that did not need explanation. For a moment neither of them spoke, and the silence between them did not feel empty, it felt full, like something was still settling into place. Then Richard exhaled slowly and said, "Most people would have walked past that." His voice calm, not judgmental, just honest, and Amara tilted her head slightly, considering it before answering. "Maybe they did," she said, and the words landed differently than expected, because they suggested that the difference was not what people saw, but what they chose to do with it. Richard absorbed that, the simplicity of it cutting through layers of assumption, and for a moment, he looked out across the platform again, at the people moving, the conversations forming, the quiet continuation of life around them, and he realized how many moments like this might pass unnoticed every day. His assistant stepped forward again, holding a phone now, his voice careful. "They are asking for a statement, sir," he said. "They want to know what happened here." And the question hung in the air, not just as a request, but as a reflection of the world waiting beyond the station, ready to turn this into something consumable, something explained in headlines and summaries. Richard looked at the phone, then back at Amara, and for a second, he did not answer, because the idea of explaining it felt incomplete, like reducing something complex into something simple. "Tell them the truth," he said finally, his voice steady. "That someone paid attention when it mattered." And the assistant nodded once, stepping away to relay the message without adding anything to it. Amara watched that exchange quietly, then looked up at Richard again, her expression thoughtful. "Will they believe that?" she asked, and Richard met her gaze, a faint shift in his expression, something softer, more reflective. "Some will," he said, "and some will not." And there was no frustration in it, just acceptance. Amara nodded slightly, as if that answer made sense, then glanced back toward the train, where the final stages of inspection were underway, the specialists moving with calm certainty now, their work transitioning from discovery into resolution. Her grandmother adjusted her scarf, her hand briefly brushing against Amara's shoulder again, a small, grounding gesture, and Amara leaned into it for just a second before straightening, her focus returning outward. Richard noticed that. The quiet reassurance, and it stayed with him, not as something to analyze, but as something to remember. "Do you always notice things like that?" he asked after a moment, and Amara thought about it, her eyes drifting slightly as she searched for the answer. "Not always," she said. "Just when something feels different." And the phrasing lingered because it was not about sight, it was about awareness, about paying attention to what did not fit. Richard nodded slowly, the idea settling deeper, because it aligned with something he had once relied on but had not practiced in the same way for a long time. The supervisor approached again, this time with a slight shift in posture, less urgency, more closure. "We have confirmed the situation is under control," he said, addressing them. Briefly, "We will continue with protocols, but there is no immediate risk." And the words moved through the space with quiet reassurance, easing the tension that had held everything in place. People nearby exhaled, conversations resumed with a lighter tone, and movement picked up slightly. But the awareness remained, like an undercurrent that would not disappear entirely. Richard acknowledged the supervisor with a nod, then turned back to Amara, lowering his stance just enough to meet her at eye level again, and when he spoke, his voice carried something new, not authority, not distance, but respect. "You could have stayed quiet," he said, and Amara met his gaze without hesitation. "But I did not," she replied, and the simplicity of that answer held everything within it, the choice, the moment, the outcome. Richard held that for a second, then nodded once, a small gesture, but one that carried more weight than any agreement he had made that day. The station lights reflected softly off the polished floor, the environment settling back into motion, but not into forgetfulness. And as people began to move more freely again, following new directions, adjusting their plans, the moment they stood and did not fade, it remained, quiet and steady, a reminder that sometimes the most important change does not come from power or position, but from a single decision to speak when it would have been easier to stay silent. The station had nearly returned to motion, but not to the version it had been before, because something quieter had settled into the space, something that stayed even as footsteps resumed and voices lifted slightly above whispers. The delayed train still stood in place, now no longer the center of tension but a quiet reminder of what had been interrupted. Its polished surface reflecting a platform that had changed in ways no announcement could fully explain. Richard stood with a stillness that did not belong to his usual world, his attention not divided across tasks or schedules, but held in a single moment that continued to unfold in layers. Amara remained beside her grandmother, her posture calm, her presence steady, no longer the interruption, but something more central, something that had quietly shifted the direction of everything around her. A soft announcement echoed again, informing passengers of updated routes and estimated delays, and people responded with small adjustments, gathering their things, exchanging brief glances, moving forward with a different kind of awareness than before. Richard watched them, not with impatience, but with recognition. Because he could see it now, the hesitation before action, the second look where there had not been one before. "They are thinking more now," Amara said softly, her eyes following the movement of a couple as they checked their tickets twice before walking away, and Richard nodded, because she was right. The entire space felt more deliberate, as if attention itself had been recalibrated. "So are we," he replied, and the words carried a quiet truth that extended beyond the moment. Amara looked up at him briefly, then back toward the platform, her expression thoughtful, as if she was measuring something that did not have clear edges. Her grandmother adjusted her stance again, one hand resting lightly on Amara's shoulder, not guiding, not holding, just there, a constant presence that did not need to be explained. Richard noticed that again, the simplicity of it, and it stayed with him, not as something to analyze, but as something to understand. The assistant returned, his posture composed but softer than usual. "Arrangements are ready whenever you decide," he said quietly, and Richard acknowledged him with a small nod, but did not move, because leaving now felt incomplete, like stepping away before something had fully settled. Instead, he turned his attention back to Amara, lowering his stance slightly again, not out of formality, but out of intention. "What will you do next?" he asked, and the question was not about travel, not about logistics, it was about her, about the moment after this moment. Amara thought about it for a second, her gaze drifting toward the tracks, then back. "I think I will just go where I was going," she said, and there was something in the way she said it that made it feel grounded, not dismissive, just simple, as if the path forward did not need to change because of what had happened. Richard absorbed that, the steadiness of it, and it contrasted with how often he had altered entire plans for far smaller reasons. "That makes sense," he said quietly, and for once, he meant it without adding anything more. A nearby officer walked past, offering a brief nod toward them, a silent acknowledgement that the situation was under control, that what needed to be done had been done, and the platform responded to that presence. With a subtle easing, shoulders relaxing, conversations resuming with a little more confidence, Amara watched the officer pass, then looked back at Richard, her expression calm but direct. "Are you going to do something different now?" she asked, and the question landed with unexpected clarity, because it reached beyond the station, beyond the moment, into something less defined but more important. Richard did not answer right away, because the truth was still forming, still settling into something he could name. He looked out across the platform again, at the people moving with more awareness, at the train that had been stopped by a single voice, at the quiet space that had held everything long enough for it to be seen. Then he looked back at Amara, meeting her gaze fully, and when he spoke, his voice carried something new, something that had not been there before. "Yes," he said, and the word was simple, but it held weight, not as a promise to her, but as a recognition within himself. Amara studied his expression for a second, as if measuring whether the answer was real, then gave a small nod, accepting it without question. Her grandmother smiled faintly, not broadly, just enough to show that something had been understood. The station lights cast a steady glow across the platform, reflecting off the polished floor, creating a quiet brightness that felt more grounded than before. Movement continued. But it no longer felt automatic, it felt chosen. Richard stood there for another moment, then straightened slightly, not returning to his old posture, but stepping into something adjusted, something that carried the weight of what had just happened. Amara turned her attention back toward the direction they would eventually go, her presence calm, her awareness still intact, and as the platform continued its slow return to motion, the moment did not fade, it settled, becoming something that would not be left behind when they walked away, but carried forward in the way they saw, the way they noticed, and the way they chose to listen when something small asked to be heard. The platform no longer felt like a place people passed through, it felt like a place that had witnessed something, something quiet but permanent, and even as movement returned and voices rose back into normal conversation, there was a softness underneath it all, like the echo of a moment that refused to disappear. The delayed train still stood in place, no longer urgent, no longer central, just there, reflecting the overhead lights and the people who now moved differently around it. Richard Caldwell adjusted his stance, not out of habit, but as if he was still settling into a version of himself that had shifted without warning. His assistant remained nearby, silent now, no longer guiding, no longer pushing forward, just present, adapting to a pace that did not belong to their usual world. Amara stood beside her grandmother, her hand lightly brushing against the older woman's sleeve. Her posture relaxed but grounded, as if she had already stepped beyond the moment, while still holding on to what it meant. The announcement overhead called for passengers to begin boarding a replacement train on another track, the voice calm, steady, and this time, people moved with intention, not rush, checking, looking, pausing just a second longer than they might have before. Richard watched them, really watched them, and for the first time in a long time, he did not see numbers or schedules or outcomes, he saw choices, small ones, unfolding in real time. He turned back to Amara, lowering himself slightly again, meeting her at eye level, and for a moment, he did not speak, because there was nothing left to explain, only something to acknowledge. "You changed more than just today," he said finally, his voice quiet, not for effect, but because the truth of it did not need to be loud. "And?" Amara looked at him, her expression steady, thoughtful. "I just said what I saw," she replied, the same words, the same simplicity, but this time they carried something deeper, something that had settled into both of them. Richard nodded once, a small movement, but one that held more weight than anything he had done earlier, because it was not agreement, it was acceptance. Her grandmother stepped forward slightly, offering a small, respectful nod, and Richard returned it without hesitation, not as a gesture of politeness, but as recognition. The assistant shifted, speaking softly. "They are ready when you are." And for a second, The familiar structure of decision returned, the idea of moving on, of stepping back into the world that waited beyond this station. Richard looked toward the direction of the new platform, then back at Amara, and something in that pause mattered, because it was not hesitation, it was intention. "Safe travels?" he said to her, and the words were simple, but they carried something more, something that did not need to be named. Amara nodded. "You too," she replied, and there was no distance in it, no hierarchy, just a shared moment that had leveled something unseen. For a brief second, either of them moved, and in that stillness, the entire station seemed to settle around them, the sound of footsteps, the murmur of voices, the distant hum of trains, all blending into something steady, something real. Then Amara turned slightly, her grandmother guiding her gently toward the direction of the new platform, not pulling, just moving together, and Amara took a few steps before pausing, glancing back once, not to check, not to question, just to acknowledge, and Richard was still there, watching, not with control, not with expectation, but with something quieter, something that had not been there before. He gave a small nod, barely visible, and she returned it just as simply before continuing forward. Richard stood where he was for a moment. Longer, the space around him shifting as people passed, the world beginning to resume its forward motion, but he did not step into it immediately. Instead, he looked once more at the train that had almost carried him away, then at the path Amara had taken, and something in that contrast stayed with him, not as a lesson, not as a realization, but as something deeper, something that would unfold over time. His assistant waited, silent, understanding that this moment did not need to be rushed, and when Richard finally moved, it was not with the same urgency as before, but with a steadiness that matched the rhythm of everything around him. He stepped forward, not just toward the next train, but into something adjusted, something quieter, something more aware, and as the station continued its slow return to motion, the echo of that single voice remained, not in the air, but in the way people walked, the way they looked, the way they listened, a reminder that sometimes, the smallest interruption carries the weight of everything that follows, and that listening, truly listening, can change more than just a moment. It can change the way a person moves through the world long after the sound itself has faded.